I've been privileged to visit some of the world's greatest museums. The Louvre in Paris, the Uffizi in Florence, the Metropolitan, the Guggenheim in New York, and the British Museum in London, perhaps my favorite. I just tell you that to let you know how really sophisticated I am. But you already knew that, I know. If you go to any of these museums, they have large sections with paintings, but by all the great masters throughout the history. And many of the paintings have religious themes, particularly depicting biblical stories. But the story of Jesus walking on the water, I've never seen depicted by any of the great masters. And I'm not sure why that's so, but maybe, I suppose, it's just hard to depict Peter in this scene, because Peter is somewhere between glory and absolute terror. And when you think about it, maybe that's the point. So much of the Christian life is somewhere between glory and terror. We all experience great high moments of grace, yet we all find ourselves at times in the darkest of valleys. Times when we feel like we're literally walking on water, and times when we feel like we are definitely drowning. And I guess there's a certain bipolar quality to the Christian life. Last week we saw Jesus feeding the 5,000, and that gospel is really the gospel of vocation. Jesus tells his disciples, give the crowd something to eat. And Jesus in turn blesses the bread and the fish, and the disciples distribute it to the crowds, reminding us that we are to do the same. Today's gospel is more the picture of faith, the life of faith for a Christian, or maybe it's better said, half faith, faith mixed with fear and doubt, which is the typical state of most Christians, as it was with the very first disciples. The walking on water, attested to in all the Gospels, is slightly different in Matthew's Gospel, because Matthew adds the story of Peter trying to walk on the water towards Jesus. And Matthew isn't so worried about Peter's reputation, even though Peter is the leader appointed by Jesus of his disciples. And we see this kind of seesaw back and forth with Peter in the Gospel, particularly at the end during the Passion. Peter is a larger-than-life character. He's impetuous. He's ready for anything. He tends to act first and think later. And that's an endearing quality, but it's also a very risky characteristic. But would you rather have a friend who did what seemed right at the time and then worried about it later, or one who spent so much time thinking it through that it takes weeks to get anything done? At this point, as we hear this gospel story, we should take a step back and look at it in a larger context. It's really a picture of our world. We are the disciples in the boat. They had seen so much of Jesus' power, they had heard his teaching, witnessed the miracles, and they had prayed his prayer. But now they were stuck. They were professional fishermen. They were struggling with the oars, unable to make headway against the winds. We too in our world have discovered much, and yet we still are without power to do many of the things that really matter. We've invented wonderful machines for making war, but nobody has found a machine for making peace. We can put a man on the moon, but we can't fill hungry stomachs. And we could even hear the songs of the whales and the dolphins from the ocean floor, but we often can't hear the cries of human souls right down the street. So in the midst of all that, we see coming towards us, walking on the water, this very strange figure. Most of the world knows at least a little bit about Jesus, but he seems ghastly, an image from some distant past, a fantasy, a mirage, unrelated to our world and to our problems. Some find him frightening, others wish he'd go away, leave us alone. And even those who do believe in him, like the disciples, simply don't know what to expect from him. But you have to admit, he seems to be doing the impossible. And sometimes we get the idea that it would be good to try and copy him if only we could. Walk on water, feed 5,000 people. Some of us set off with exactly that aim, to do just that, to bring his love and power, his peace and hope to a needy world. That really is the essence of a life of faith. But, like Peter, we let our eyes drop for a moment and we see the roaring waves, we feel the mighty wind, and our faith is replaced with darkness, fear, and hurricane-force winds. That's what happens when we step out of the boat. When you read Matthew's gospel, there's a lot of allegory in there. Whenever you see the disciples in a boat with Peter at the helm, it's a metaphor for the church. And the church is often described as the bark of Peter. So Matthew is telling us, as we listen to the details of this story, first, after feeding the 5,000, Jesus tells the disciples to get into the boat and to go to the other side of the lake. The boat, of course, is the church, with Peter at its head. And the lake is his history, his time, as the church moves through the various times and places of history. And Jesus goes up to the mountain, in a sense, prefiguring the resurrection, when Jesus would return to be with his Father. And it is from heaven that Jesus intercedes for us, his church. But as the church begins to make this great adventure through history, it very quickly encounters storms, troubles, difficulties, fears, and doubts. There may have been some success at first, but it's quickly met with some failure and much trouble. Think of all the times in the history of the church when Christians are persecuted, or when we cause trouble of our own making and we become divided, we split apart as believers. And Matthew tells us that it's in the midst of this raging storm, the fourth watch of the night, which is the darkest time of night, the time when really nothing good ever happens, the time when our fears are the worst, that Jesus comes walking towards them. It's then in those moments of greatest difficulty that Christ appears to us, showing us who he is, showing us that like the God who created the heavens and the earth, separated the water from the land, Jesus likewise has power over all the elements, all the forces of the world that threaten us. And we see this wonderful story now between Jesus and Peter. Peter sees the Lord, finally recognizes him, and says, "Lord, I want to come to you if you could command me to do so." Peter gets out and he does begin walking on the water, as long as he is connected to Jesus. I think here Matthew is telling us that you too, as a church, will have the same power that Jesus had if you remain connected to him. You too can walk through the midst of the storms in peace. But as soon as you take your eyes, your focus off of the Lord, you begin to sink. We've all been there. And at that moment, Peter cries out, "Lord, save me." How many times have we called out, "Lord, save me"? And the Lord stretches out his hand and grasps Peter, and he puts him back in the boat. In other words, he's saying to Peter, stay in the church. Because when you step out of the church, you're bound to hit trouble that you cannot handle. You're bound to maybe at first have some success on your own, just through the sheer force of your ego or through your willpower. But eventually the storms will overtake you and you will begin to sink. So stay in the church and find the protection that comes from being in that boat. You know, there are times when Jesus asks us to do what seems impossible. We think, how can we even begin to do the task that he calls us to? With all our struggles, with all our doubts, with all our lack of faith. Or how can we even think about giving up that sin which we're called to give up? Or how can we really develop a serious habit of prayer when we're so busy, frantic, and disorganized? Of course, like Peter, when we look at the waves and the wind, we too will conclude that it's impossible. Yet, what we are called to do, it's so basic and so obvious, but really so hard in practice. To keep our eyes fixed on Jesus, to not get distracted, not to place our faith in anything else, not to give in to our worst fears, but keeping our eyes focused on the Lord, our ears open for encouragement, and our wills and our hearts ready to do whatever he asks, even if it seems crazy at the time. So Matthew tells us very clearly in the words of Jesus, stay in the boat, and you will get safely to the other shore.